Most people are using practice questions like all wrong, which is a big issue, right? Because practice questions are one of the most effective study strategies you can use out of all of them. This form of studying, or this form of active recall, has the most evidence in academic journals, and in my immediate circle in medical school is used by the top students. And practice questions can increase your exam scores more than any other studying technique if used properly. However, if you're not using practice questions correctly, they might not bring your score up, but they might actually bring your score down, which is what happened to me. This is because only certain practice questions should be used when you're studying, after a specific amount of time spent studying. So here are the 8 biggest mistakes that people make when using practice questions, and I'll tell you also how to fix them. So first and foremost, what are practice questions, right? So practice questions are just any questions that mimic the questions you're gonna get on test day, or they mimic the questions you're gonna get on your oral exam or your written exam or whatever kind of exam you're gonna have. And these questions can be from anywhere, right? They can be from your teacher, the back of the textbook, internet resources, or you could even just craft one of these questions. But really, practice question is an amazing study resource, and there's lots of evidence that support practice questions as one of the best ways to study, one of the best ways to improve your scores when it comes to exam day. And let's talk about a little bit of the research. So one study that looked at a bunch of other studies, over 100 other studies, and a bunch of study techniques, over 10 study techniques, rated these methods as either high utility, medium utility, or low utility. And they only rated actually 3 of these study techniques as high utility. Can you guess what they are? Well, it's active recall, interleaved practice, which is just spaced repetition, and practice testing. And the ones that didn't get great scores were, again, I say this so much, but summarizing, highlighting, rereading. Not so great. Another experiment looked at 324 undergraduate students and surveyed their habits, and they correlated those habits to GPA. And what they found was interesting. They found 85% of the students with a GPA of 3.7 to 4.0 reported using practice questions, while only 65% of the students with the lowest GPA, which is 1.7 to 2.1, reported using practice questions. So in the top scorers, 85% of them were using practice questions, and in the lowest scorers, 65% of them were using practice questions. Finally, one study looked at a bunch of pharmacy students and compared their performance on a test when just rewatching or rereading the material versus being tested on the material. And what they found is testing might be more efficient, i.e. cost effective, for long-term performance. Students who attend class may want to avoid rewatching courses in favor of practice testing. Briefly, I wanted to go over that because the evidence points consistently to practice testing being one of the best methods there are. So how are we using it wrong? What ways can we use practice testing better? Let's get into it. So the first mistake I see is people are starting way too early. I remember when I first started medical school, I wanted to be the best student there was. I bought every single textbook, every single resource, every online thing I could get my hands on, I bought. And that included a really big question bank. And I remember one of the first questions that I saw was something like, which is the drug that treats this disease characterized by Reed-Sternberg cells, and the most common side effect of this drug is dilated cardiomyopathy. And this was like the first question I saw. And I remember I was completely lost. I didn't even know who this Reed-Sternberg guy was. Like, why are they naming cell stuff after a guy? Who does that? Like any form of active recall, including practice questions, you need to have a basic understanding of the topic before you dive in. And if we remember Bloom's taxonomy of learning, it goes something like this: remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. But I wasn't even at the first stage yet. I wasn't even at the remembering phase, and I was trying to do practice questions. Stupidly, however, I kept blasting through practice questions, and I really had no idea what was going on in a lot of these questions. I was just guessing questions and not even understanding the answer explanations. It was a real waste of time. So before you start doing practice questions, make sure you have a basic understanding of what's going on. If there are 2 or 3 words in the question that you don't understand, you've probably started a little bit too early. Most common mistake number 2, and this is a really simple mistake, but using the wrong questions. If, for example, you have a test in math, right, and you have to cover this certain chapter in the textbook for this test, and the chapter in the textbook covers differential equations and also partial differential equations, but the test, you're only going to be tested on regular differential equations. But if you do all the questions in the back of the textbook, those are also going to include partial differential equations as well, right? And that's just a big waste of time, because you don't need to be spending the time studying those things, because because you're not going to be tested on that. And the reason I say this is because sometimes test makers or your teachers or professors or whatever, they'll give you a textbook of the chapter to like learn and study from, right? But they won't be necessarily testing you on every single question in the back of that textbook. So it's a good idea to ask your teacher or ask your professor, what are the best specific questions for me to do so I perform the best I can on this test and understand what you're trying to get me to understand. The third most common mistake I see, and this is similar to the mistake of starting too early, is starting too hard. So again, I'm going to reference textbooks because I think that's where we all first remember doing practice questions. If we go to a textbook and we look at the practice questions in the back of the textbook, you'll see that the beginning questions are usually much easier. So question 1, question 2, question 3. But when you get to question 59, 60, 61, those are usually more difficult questions. And that's for a reason, right? The people that wrote the textbook want you to start to build your understanding, build your confidence before you have a go at these more difficult questions. Then importantly, once you go from the easy questions to the hard questions, don't only do the hard questions. Do the questions in the format that you will be tested on, right? So for example, in medical school, we have some hard questions, we have some easy questions, we have some medium questions, and they're not in any order throughout the test, right? They're kind of randomized. So after I did some easy questions to get a basic understanding of whatever I was learning about, I would do a mixed bag of questions, so some easy, medium, hard questions. And usually question banks have this, right? So they have, this is a harder set of questions, this is an easier set of questions, and so on. But if you're in high school, I remember in high school, I was always tested on easier questions first that would get progressively harder. So that's the way I would study again. Maybe I'd create myself a little test and I'd have some easier questions, some medium questions, and then hard questions at the end. So the fourth most common mistake is looking at the answers too early. So when you're doing practice questions, for example, do you A, look at the practice question and then immediately look at the answer? Do a couple practice questions and then look at the answer? Or look at the question and then without coming up with an answer, just look at the answer anyway, just because the question was too hard? Only one of those three options is awfully bad, and that's the last option. And the reason is because when you're doing these practice questions, if you have an attempt, it actually helps in your learning, even if you don't know if you got the right answer or not. So in one amazing study, they had students study in 3 of the following ways and then take a test. The first one was take some tests and then get feedback, or do some practice questions and then get no feedback, so don't know the answers, or just not do practice questions and reread the content. Well, guess what? The students that did practice questions with no feedback scored significantly higher than the students who did the practice questions with the answers. And the difference between them and the students that actually had the answers wasn't that big either. The biggest difference was between the students who did practice testing versus students who didn't do any practice testing whatsoever. And it's a really powerful way of improving your learning, and schools know this. Institutions know this. That's why you have so many annoying tests, so many annoying quizzes, because they know even when you're tested, even if you don't know the answer, your retention of this information improves just because you did the testing. I remember, especially in the beginning of medical school, I was looking at questions that seemed so impossibly hard, but I understood all the words in it, remember, so I'm not starting too early, but they seemed so impossibly hard, I just didn't want to have an attempt. I just wanted to look at the answer. Resist that urge, because every time you do that, you're wasting a question. And that leads very nicely into mistake number 5, is not mimicking test day. Why do I do a bunch of questions in a row as I approach test day? Because it mimics test day. Why do I only do multiple choice questions? Because I'm only going to be tested with multiple choice questions on test day in medical school. Another reason is test day is often stressful. So we want to do everything we can to minimize our stress, minimize surprising things during test day. So you should ask yourself the following questions. What is the test going to be like? Will they be multiple choice or fill in the blank or essay or math problems? How many total questions will there be? How long will I have to complete the whole test? Will it be open book or closed book? Will I have a calculator or no calculator? And it may seem silly, but also think about, what am I going to be wearing during test day? What am I going to be eating during test day? Will I be drinking? Will I have allowed to bring in water during it? Will I have drank coffee beforehand? How long beforehand will I have drank coffee? Will I be able to use the bathroom during the test, or will that take away time from my test? I remember when I was studying and preparing for the most important exam of my life, the MCAT, the exam that determined my competitiveness for medical school, I would wake up at the same time every day. That was the same time that I would wake up for my test. And I would go sit down in the same chair every single day. And I even bought a crappy keyboard and a crappy mouse because I knew during test day I'd have a crappy keyboard and a crappy mouse. Some other crazy things that I did is when I was trying to mimic test day exactly, and I did this maybe 3 or 4 times before test day happened, is I would wake up, wear the same exact clothing, eat the same exact food, get ready in the same exact way, pack my bag in the same exact way, and then I would actually drive out of my house and then drive back. And I'd only be allowed to use the things that I brought in my backpack, so any snacks or water or anything like that. Then I'd go upstairs with the timer set exactly the same that would be on test day, so I'd do a certain test section for a certain amount of time, and then I'd have a break. Section, break. No phone the entire time, because I knew I didn't want to have my phone at all during test day either. And then at the very end of the day, I was done completely, right? And again, I only ate the packed snacks, I only ate the packed lunch I had, I only drank the coffee that I brought with me, because I wanted to see what it was like to mimic test day exactly, and it helped me so much when it came to test day, and I ended up scoring like way higher than I ever thought possible. And I don't say that to brag, even though like I'm really happy with my score. I say that because the possibilities when you take practice questioning seriously are huge. Like, you can jump your score by more than you ever thought possible if you just consistently commit to putting in the work. Mistake number 6 is not focusing on the specific content you got wrong. Depending on what you're studying and what you're doing, I don't really know. It could be anything, right? But most questions, especially in higher education, are going to be like 2-step, 3-step, or 4-step questions. And what that means is you're going to have to answer 4 questions before you get to the final answer. So if we look at that first question that I asked myself, that first practice question that I did when I wasn't ready for practice question, what is the drug that treats a disease characterized by Reed-Sternberg cells, and the most common side effect of this drug is dilated cardiomyopathy, right? So the first thing you need to do is identify what are Reed-Sternberg cells. So that's number 1. Okay, I know what Reed-Sternberg cells, they're in Hodgkin's lymphoma. So I've identified Hodgkin's lymphoma is the disease I'm treating. And then I need to know what are the drugs that treat Hodgkin's lymphoma. And there's a couple drugs, so I don't know which one it is. But then they say the most common side effect is dilated cardiomyopathy, step 3. So I can link that side effect to that big group of drugs and say, okay, I know that's doxorubicin. And then you get to the answer of doxorubicin through 3 steps. Now, importantly, if I got that question wrong, I'd want to identify at what stage in that thinking I got the question wrong. Did I get it wrong at stage 1, where I didn't even know what Reed-Sternberg cells, but I knew about doxorubicin's side effect and I knew about the certain drugs? Well, then I don't need to test myself on the doxorubicin side effects, right? I only need to test myself on linking Reed-Sternberg cells to Hodgkin's lymphoma. And that's the only way I should retest myself or restudy that content. Or maybe I shouldn't hold up the middle finger there. No kidding. Or maybe I don't know that the treatment for Hodgkin's lymphoma is doxorubicin and these other drugs, so I need to learn that. Or maybe I don't know the most common side effect of doxorubicin is dilated cardiomyopathy. So you need to figure out where in the question you got it wrong and focus on that point to where you study. Because if I relearned all that information, that would waste a ton of time because I already know these certain things. Or maybe I really have no understanding of that question whatsoever, and then I do need to take the time to relearn what's going on. So when you get a question wrong, whenever you get any practice question wrong, take the time to think, okay, where specifically in this question did I get tripped up? What did I actually get wrong? Why did I get this question wrong? And learn to study that specific piece of content, not the whole question, because it's a waste of time. And you also want to mark down the specific piece of information you didn't understand right then and there, because if you go back to that question like 2 hours or 3 hours or the next day later, you might not remember why you actually got that question wrong, and you'll end up having to relearn like everything. But how do I keep track of all these different specific things I got wrong, you might ask? Well, welcome to tip number 7. The most common mistake number 7 is not converting your incorrect questions into flashcards. So Ebbinghaus, I hope I'm saying that right, famously found that we forget about 40% of the information that we learn in 20 minutes and 66% of that information in 24 hours. So we need something to fight this forgetting curve, and that's what it's called, the forgetting curve. We need to test ourselves at intervals that will make sure we don't forget that information quickly, or spaced repetition. And one fantastic way to do spaced repetition is with flashcards. And that's exactly what I would do with every single piece of content I got wrong on the practice question. So again, apply the previous tip to this tip. Go through the practice questions you got wrong. Figure out which part of the question you actually got wrong and convert that piece of knowledge into a specific flashcard. And the way I take this tip to another level is whenever I get a question wrong, I actually screenshot that question and put it in my Anki flashcard. If it was in a textbook, maybe I'd take a picture with my phone and put it on a flashcard. Or if it's on the back of a physical flashcard, maybe you can just write down the problem number on it. Because this way, when you're going through the flashcards and you see, okay, this is a flashcard that I'm getting getting wrong a lot, you can go to the actual part in the textbook and read the practice question, and it all links back very, very nicely. But overall, what were we gonna do? We're gonna look at the practice question, and we're gonna see what specific part of the practice question we got wrong, and then we're gonna convert that specific piece of knowledge into a flashcard so we can save it in long-term retention in our long-term memory banks. And finally, most common mistake number 8 I see is starting too late. Remember, tip number 1 was starting too early. Tip number 8 is starting too late, because practice questions are so powerful. Remember that most important exam of my life, the MCAT? Well, I studied for that 100 days from 8 o'clock in the morning to 5 o'clock at night for 100 days straight during my summer. I dedicated my entire summer to that. It was rough, but I started doing practice questions from day 1 because I knew how important and how much of an impact practice questions were going to have on my grade. The MCAT really just takes all these topics that you already kind of have a basic understanding of and makes them a little bit more difficult, adds a little bit of changes, a little bit of more intricacies to them. So I didn't need to wait to start doing practice questions because I already had a good enough basic understanding. The more practice questions you do, the better you will do, so start early. Finally, I've implemented my Anki strategy in a specific way and designed my cards in a specific way to focus on understanding instead of memorization. And I've outlined this and everything you could possibly need to know about using Anki for school, using Anki to get the best grades possible on Skillshare, who are kindly sponsoring this video. Flashcards are life. And beyond just becoming an A student, Skillshare has changed my life. It got me to start this YouTube channel. It helped me organize my life in regards to productivity in a way that I could focus on the things that were really important to me, my dreams of becoming a doctor, so that now in the next month, I'll be a doctor. And it has just taught me cool things. The first 1,000 people to use my link can join Skillshare for 1 month completely for free. So if my Anki class or creating new career possibilities through optimizing your time, managing your productivity, and kind of learning about things that will be viable and helpful in starting a new career interest you in any way, I strongly suggest you join Skillshare. But that's it. Those are the 8 biggest mistakes I see people making when using practice questions. So fix those mistakes, get better at doing practice questions, and get better scores on your tests. But thank you so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one.